So, Tony, here we are. The Conduit Coffee House, also affectionately known as Sid's on Lamb's Conduit Street, Bloomsbury, central London. Tony White, author of The Fountain in the Forest, first novel for Faber, I think, for 14 years,
yep.
Which I also edited, Foxy Tea. We're here for a specific reason. Tell us why and tell us about the settings in the book.
Yeah, The Fountain in the Forest, just to give a quick intro, is first of three novels that's exploring this strange, slightly overlooked period in British history. The 90 days immediately following the miners' strike, between the end of the miners' strike and the Battle of the Beanfield on the 1st of June 1985, the largest civilian mass arrest in British history, when all the techniques, the policing techniques that have been used against the miners were brought to bear on a small civilian population, another civilian population. And it's looking at this period through the lens of the French Revolutionary calendar. And the novel is set in London, in this area of London now, in the south of France, in a sort of extraordinary abandoned village up in the mountains above Nice on the French Riviera, and at the Battle of the Beanfield itself. And this part of London is this from Covent Garden down Theobald's Road, Clerkenwell, is the beat of Detective Sergeant Rex King, who works out of Holborn Police Station just over the road. And when the novel opens, Rex is on his way to a call-out, a serious incident, backstage at the Royal Palace Theatre in Covent Garden, in the paint frame, in fact, the place where all the scene backdrops are painted and the theatrical gauzes. And he's kind of half running to the Royal Palace Theatre because this is the workshop studio of his friend Terence, who paints these kind of theatrical gauzes. And in fact, this is based on a real location. There is a paint frame backstage in a famous London theatre quite close to here. And but the slightly terrifying thing about the space, once you get over the size of the place, you realise that you're on a very narrow gangway, and on either side of you is this huge drop that's as big as the room is high, slightly vertiginous kind of space. Yeah, it's really dramatic. Incredible. And I just couldn't get this space out of my head, and I knew that had to be the kind of centre of gravity for the opening of the novel. So the novel had to be kind of set in this area and kind of gravitate towards that space. So on the surface of it, as it were, sort of the visible surface of the book is kind of a murder mystery. Bodies discovered. It's kind of got a whodunit aspect to it. But you're known as a literary writer, as an experimental writer. What drew you as a literary writer to exploring genre fiction? That's a good question. First of all, I wanted to. As I was saying, the novel's one of three novels exploring this kind of strange 90-day period in British history. But I didn't just want to plod through events across those 90 days. I wanted to be able to move backwards and forwards in time. And Gertrude Stein, the great modernist writer Gertrude Stein, had a great line where she was talking in her lecture, What Are Masterpieces? She's talking about the problem with writing fiction in a mass media age. And this is in 1936. But it still rings true. And she's saying, when everybody already knows what's going on, merely to relate events in a piece of fiction is beyond boring. It's inane, And for her, the detective novel is the single modern novelistic form. And her reasoning for this was that she'd say that because the person is dead from the beginning, you don't have to worry about events. And she also should say that in real life, it's the crime that's the thing, the thrill, the horror, the shock is the actual crime itself. But in a story, it's the detection that's the thrill. And here, with this novel, I was looking at, maybe asking the question whether there was a revolution in policing in the immediate aftermath of the miners' strike. And in order to investigate this question, I need a man or a woman on the inside. I need a detective. And so all of these things kind of added up to.
So in some sense, Rex is you.
Rex is our investigator, you know, on the inside. I mean, the great thing about detective novels is they are kind of like machines for telling stories. You know, look at this kind of Ellery Queen novel. I love these things. 10 Days Wonder, this is called. And you read an Ellery Queen mystery, every page there's a kind of reversal or an acceleration, an amplification, a rug is pulled, something that, and the machine keeps getting cranked up tighter and tighter. So it's like a kind of bowstring, you know. And I really wanted to have that kind of machinery at my disposal. But I'm also more interested in a different kind of detective story, a different lineage that goes back to Gertrude Stein's Blood on the Dining Room Floor, or Robe Grillet, The Erasers. These more experimental detective novels, which used to be called postmodern detective novels, but doesn't quite do it justice. Paul Auster's New York trilogy, Perex, La Disparition. These, you know, a detective novel written without using the letter E, but that still obtains as a detective novel. And what I like about that lineage, that area of work, is that there's more at stake. Yes, they're a detective novel, but you're also kind of just incredulous at the audacity of the experiment that's unfolding in your hands.
The construction of it.
Exactly.
So we talked a bit about the book as a detective, it's a detective fiction, but as you've intimated, there's much more going on there, and there is a not to, you know, to use a word that I know some people find intimidating. There's an experimental side to the book. Can you talk a little bit about the structure and the techniques, the literary techniques that you've used in The Fountain in the Forest?
Yeah, the main techniques that we used were to first of all looking at this period through the lens of the French Revolutionary calendar. And we've got 90 days, and the French Revolutionary calendar is an incredible piece of culture, you know, which was created by an anarchist playwright in the French Revolutionary period called Sylvain Maréchal, and he wanted to create a non-hierarchical calendar where there were no days dedicated to royalty or saints, but everything was uniform, and there'd be 10-day weeks. Occasional festivals, you know, if you needed to fill out the year to cover leap years and things. But basically 10-day weeks where every day is dedicated to an item of everyday rural life, like a plant, a foodstuff, vinegar, you know, a fork, anything, a livestock, an item of livestock. And this is a great piece of culture, but it's also about everyday life and observing everyday life. So I wanted to apply this to the 90 days between the miners' strike and the Battle of the Beanfield, because through a system of 10-day weeks that becomes 9 revolutionary weeks, which is was quite an attraction. And as a novelist, having a finite period of time that's sandwiched between two cataclysmic events is such a kind of gift.
And a discipline.
And a discipline, and so that is overlaid onto the novel. But then, while I was researching the period, mainly in newspaper archives at the British Library, their old warehouse up in Colindale, and more recently at Euston Road, I was particularly drawn to the Guardian archives, because at the time, in the mid-1980s, in 1985, exactly when this parts of this novel are set, I used to buy the Guardian every day. And not only that, but every day I would do the crossword. So as I was looking through the microfiches at the British Library, I'd see these crosswords, I think I did that crossword, you know. And I thought, actually, maybe just as a sort of distraction or just for fun, it might be quite interesting to immerse myself in the habits of the period by doing one of those crosswords again. And it's kind of a Proustian moment, lots of muscle memories and kind of recollections of details of the period kind of were opened up by doing this. But also, I quickly did them all. I did all of them, and I tested this out as well on another novella that was a chance to just see if this would work. But I did all of the crosswords again, these crosswords that I'd first done 30 odd years ago, and I realised that it was not only about re-experiencing or immersing myself in the habits of the period, but it was a sort of time capsule that I was accessing, because just the 25, 26 words, that are the solutions to these crosswords, really reflect the vocabularies of the time, the usage of the time, but also historical figures. So people, from Hastings Bander to Spike Milligan, would pop up as solutions to these crosswords, and as well as strange usages, that are now obsolete. Even 30 years later, language changes. So it almost felt like this was in Antarctica, when scientists drill down through the ice and they bring up a sample of of ice from 10,000 years ago that tells you a little bit about the conditions at the time. I thought of these little bundles of words from each day in 1985 that came out of the crosswords as a kind of core sample of the language of the time. And I remembered, of course, talking about Perec just a moment ago, that the great novelist Georges Perec, later in his life, compiled a weekly crossword for a news journal in Paris. And suddenly I started thinking about Oulipo, the group that Perec was part of, who would apply, Perec, Harry Matthews and many others, who would apply mathematical and other kinds of constraints onto the production of literature. And one of the slightly underused techniques that Oulipo proposed was the mandated vocabulary. The idea that you'd have to use every word in this mandated vocabulary to generate a piece of fiction. And I apart from a short story by Harry Matthews, a couple of other things, it hasn't really been used to its full effect, I don't think, by Oulipo. And I suddenly sort of realised that if I was to use these crossword solutions as a kind of mandated vocabulary, we'd have a novel where each day is mapped against a day in 1985, each chapter is mapped against a day in 1985, and each chapter has to be told using all of the solutions from the crossword for that day in 1985. This kind of mandated vocabulary, which imposes a sort of a meter and a kind of measure to the text, gives it a kind of well, it gives it all kinds of stuff.
It's also transforming. It gives it a kind of magical significance. Taking those words out of context is an incredibly transforming thing. I suppose the final thing that I want to ask you is about whether employing these literary techniques is a good way to investigate the past and shine a light on the past, particularly that period that you're inquiring into that period in the 1984 or so. Do these techniques allow you to see history in a different way? And also, I suppose the second part of the question is, should there be, I want you to talk a little bit about the political novel and why there aren't more writers writing in a political register these days.
Okay, that's the two more really good questions. And the first of them, well, I don't know how other novelists work, but for me, I've been trying to kind of find a way to write about this period for a decade maybe, and making kind of closer and closer passes with short stories and the novella Dickie's Star and the Garden Rule, which was a chance to test out if the mandated vocabulary idea would work, which is set in the mid-80s as well. And once that had kind of proved that this worked, it was clear that it was almost there. But the idea of the revolutionary calendar, which came from a collaboration and a series of discussions with a British artist called Stuart Brisley, a very radical political British artist, who since the early 70s had been making a series of performances that were 10 days long as a kind of an explicit reference to the revolutionary calendar. And he was talking about using the calendar as a frame within which a kind of revolutionary performance could take place. And that idea really really stuck and kind of inspired the approach here of using the revolutionary calendar as a frame. And for me, those two things were the final kind of spark. Sometimes when I'm beginning to write a novel, everything needs to come together, and then there's got to be a spark that generates the momentum to push you through the year or two that it's going to take to write it. And for me, these two techniques, the mandated vocabulary and the revolutionary calendar, were the impetus to the final kind of piece in the jigsaw, if you like. So the proof is in the pudding. I mean, I think it's allowed me to write about that period in a completely different way. I know that various other artists and writers have used the revolutionary calendar in other ways. There was an artist a couple of years ago who had an exhibition at Camden Arts Centre where she just exhibited the herbs, which is fine, but maybe it's a bit twee, it's not quite enough. And Sanja Perovic, who was my collaborator at King's College London when I was doing my residency, she's the leading expert in the Republican calendar, and she was saying, well, if you're going to observe the Republican calendar, you've got to kill the pig. You can't just do a little drawing of a pig. You've got to kill it, and because that's why the pig is there on that day, because that's the day no pigs died in the making of this novel. well, or did they? But because that's the day when you need to kill the pig. But the broader question about political writing right now is, I suppose, that leads on to several responses. One would be that novels are political whether we like it or not, and more often than novels expressing a kind of political kind of idea, politics is imposed on them. And looking at kind of literary activism in the UK in the last couple of years, a lot of that has been about a kind of politics of exclusion, and black writers of colour being excluded from the book trade, in terms of personnel and in terms of the published output. It's just not enough. And there's been really interesting activism over the last couple of years where people have used crowdfunding as a workaround to set up the Bear Lit Festival, to publish the Good Immigrant, these really, really important literary projects. And also if we kind of look beyond our own kind of privileged bubble, at least until Brexit turns us into a kind of pariah state. We're in a sort of privileged bubble here in the UK. But if you you don't have to go far before you find writers who are being imprisoned for writing stuff that isn't even that particularly political. Through English Pen and the other international pen organisations, we know about the writers who are imprisoned around the world. My friend of mine and colleague Ahmed Naji in Cairo was imprisoned for 2 years just because someone made a complaint about his novel. He's been released now, but he's still under threat, and he has to go through a trial all over again. So literature is is political whether we like it or not, and we should use this opportunity to send a message of solidarity and friendship to Ahmed and other writers who are at risk around the world. But for me also the really interesting political literatures at the moment, and this is going to sound strange, aren't novels. I think the really interesting kind of political literatures right now are these kind of vast archives that are not even readable by humans. They're so big. So the proceedings of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is text. It's millions of pages of transcripts exploring how it was possible that a criminal genocidal conspiracy at a nation-state level could exist in Europe. It's impossible for anyone to read that, though it's kind of essential that we do understand that. And stories, experimental techniques perhaps are a way into those kinds of archives and thinking about politics on those kinds of scales. But I think stories of any kind, I don't think stories have ever been more important than they are now.